I just want to say thank you for inviting me. First of all, it's really good to be invited down here, especially to speak to such a large, and I'll try not to be intimidated by that, audience. But I think what was said at the beginning about the kind of intersection between Marxism and feminism is important, and I'll try to kind of address that throughout what I'm saying. I mean, I think my main focus in what I'm going to talk about is how the women's struggle and the class struggle, in my opinion, go hand in hand, and one can't work without the other, is how I would certainly see it that way. But to begin, to give a kind of brief introduction, which I'm sure you're probably all aware of anyway, but I think it's good to start off with the basics, and then we can kind of build up from there. It is obviously often said that sexism is a phenomenon of the past. It's often said that women in the West now have access to education, now have access to good jobs, and that like the idea that sexism still continues is refuted by several areas of society. You know, there are more women in work than ever before, and there is increased sexual liberation. But I think it's also clear, and I think that's the reason why there's so many people here today, that it's certainly not the case that sexism and misogyny have been brought to an end. The pay gap between women and men remains at around 20%, although it does depend on what country you're talking about. Some will be higher, some will be slightly less. And I think a fundamental thing, and something that I'll address further on as well, is that even though there are now more women in work, there is still the expectation that women will carry out the majority of domestic activities, which is why we see a kind of increased double burden lying upon women's shoulders. And I'll discuss this a little bit more later on, but I think also the fact that for a lot of women, I wouldn't say that work has been as emancipatory an experience as it's kind of put forward, and I think that's particularly the case for working class women, and I'll address that as I go on. I mean, obviously the past century has seen many strides for women. As more women in higher education pursued careers, and the right to abortion and the right to divorce have been key gains. But we should also recognise that women remain an exploited group, and I would argue that the form of the exploitation that women are experiencing is come out of class society, and as class society has changed and become more complex, so too has that exploitation maybe become slightly less obvious than it would have been 100 years ago, and taking place in, maybe obvious is the wrong word, I'd say taking place in different kind of ways, and I'm going to try and address that. So if we first of all consider the issue of women at work, which was probably one of the key things that the first wave feminists discussed. From about, all these statistics relate to Britain, by the way, I'll say that now just so that that's not confusion. From 1881 to about 1951, the percentage of women in work hovered around about 25%. By 1965, 54% of women were classed as economically active. I'm not entirely sure what that encompasses, but I would imagine that would mean either working or like owning a business or something like that. And I would say that this can be seen as a result of a changing scope of British capitalism, particularly in the post-war period. There was an opening up of new industry and expansion as a result of the post-war boom. However, it's also important to note that despite in this period, so more specifically talking about 1960s, 1970s, there being a greater number of women in work, a significant pay gap remained. It was around 27 to 30%, and the majority, 70% of women in work at this time, were employed in kind of more precarious service sector type jobs. So moving from the 60s on to more modern times, to the 1990s and 2000s, throughout the past 2 decades, the percentage of women at work has kind of plateaued at around 65%. However, it's clear that despite more women being in work, and that is a positive thing in general, I'll discuss the kind of contours of that later on, Women's work continues to be paid less, and it continues to be substantially located in casualised sectors, and also it continues to be gendered. It's still mostly cleaning, caring, cooking, and traditional kind of jobs. There's obviously the continuing pay gap that I spoke about earlier on, so it's about 20% in the UK, and 92% of women work in services. So the vast majority of women work in services, one of the more precarious sectors of employment, compared to 71% of men. And I think it's also important to relate this to the changing contours of the economy in Britain. I spoke earlier about how I think like the expansion of work into women was because capitalism was expanding at that time. There was growth in the economy. I mean, that was obviously related to the fact that there was a more active women's movement. I think those two kind of worked in tandem with each other, not purely structural forces, but definitely structural forces being part of that. But in terms of like when we look at the economy now, and the kind of patterns of working, I think it does relate a lot to the fact of deindustrialisation that's taken place in Britain. So the closure, I mean, obviously North East has been a key kind of place where deindustrialisation has taken place. There's been a loss of industries across Britain, so like well-paid working class male jobs predominantly have been lost. So things like mining, where I'm not from, but where I live, shipbuilding in Glasgow was a key thing. Steel, all the kind of heavy industry jobs have been lost to them for the most part. And we've seen a kind of influx of service sector work to replace that. And that's meant in certain areas, like in deindustrialised areas, it's meant that like women's participation in employment's been higher than men in certain areas. And also the good thing of women going to work, which is obviously a good thing, it's a good emancipatory thing, has been exploited by capitalists as well, because it's kind of been used as a move away from one job, one wage packet families, towards you need 2 wage packets now in order to have a decent standard of living. So we can see how gains that have been won for women have also been exploited by the ruling class as well to push down wages. And it's the same like with the service sector jobs that have replaced the industrial jobs. The wages in there are a lot lower, and the conditions are a lot worse. They're less unionised, and it means that there's much less standardisation, and things like 0-hour contracts have come in as well. So I would underline here, this is kind of what I'm trying to say, and my main point is that despite the fact that a lot of women have gone into work, and we obviously support that, it's also not necessarily been an emancipating experience. I think a lot of women have had an experience of work where they've kind of been forced into casual sectors, not making the most of their talents and abilities, and instead kind of having to slave away at minimum wage service jobs, and also continuing to be paid less than their male counterparts. I'd argue that it's a good thing that more women are into work, but it needs to be changed and it needs to be extended, and I think that goes hand in hand with the class struggle. I'd also underline that the post-war boom was a historical exception. I'd say it's something that was unusual in terms of capitalism, and the period that we're living through now is one where I know that we're technically out of recession now, but I think for a lot of people, and there's been a lot of polls that show the majority of people don't feel it, and I think this is what's important. The majority of people are still facing difficult times at work and at home in terms of having less money available than they did before, and experiencing high pay cuts, and that's affected women to a greater degree than it has men, because women are more likely to work in the public sector, which is faced they're more likely to work in the public sector, which is faced it's been put as wage freezes, but a wage freeze when it's times of inflation is obviously a wage cut. It's obvious, and they've also faced job losses. And apart from being heavily working in the public sector, women also tend to be in the kind of more casualised sectors where jobs shed a lot more easily, so they face that, but also the fact that women are more likely to rely on benefits than men, so the kind of austerity that we're experiencing will impact more upon women than it will upon other areas of society. Yeah, I think that in general, I think we can say that capitalism isn't creating prosperity for the working women or the majority of the world population, and I would argue that it's only through a socialist society that we can create the foundation that can. I don't think that will automatically lead to full emancipation for women, but I think that's the kind of conditions that would need to exist for that emancipation to take place. So it's clear that despite more women entering into the workforce, they continue to be exploited in work, and that their working, which is a positive thing, is also being used by the ruling class to further exploit the working class by making this into a two-wage, and not even just a two-wage. You're talking about, I think there was a woman in America recently that died because she was so tired. She'd been working like 3 jobs, so she got into her car to move off it, fell asleep at the wheel, and she lost her life. And I think that these things will become less exceptional as we're kind of biting through austerity. And I would also emphasise the fact that women are continuing to carry out the majority of domestic activities, so that's the double burden that we refer to. They're effectively working 2 jobs. And I'd say the reason that this is the case is obviously it's kind of a cultural expectation that women will kind of carry out these kind of jobs, but I think that this is one that's propagated that and the kind of general image of the nuclear family by capitalism, for the reason that it provides capitalism with a lot of free work, essentially, bringing up children, doing cooking, doing other domestic activities, and there's not the cultural expectation that there will be a wage for that. That is essentially free work, so this is just a further exploitation. So I think like this is, I mean, there's other things as well, like we've kind of talked about sexual liberation, and it is true that there is much more kind of liberal attitudes to sex in Britain and women's sexuality in Britain now than there were before, but obviously I think it's quite clear as well that what's kind of amounted to is like a sort of contradiction within society, where it's kind of like there's a certain expectation that women, and particularly young women, will provide men with sexual satisfaction, but at the same time this is countered with a remaining sort of conservatism that women shouldn't express their sexuality, and these are kind of like contradictory pressures that are placed upon young women. And I think obviously at universities we're kind of aware like the sort of uni lad and kind of lad culture that's become quite a big thing, and I'd say that ties in again. I mean, I think that ties in again with the fact that this is quite a lucrative sector from a capitalist point of view, the sex sector. It might not be one they like to shout about, but it's certainly one that they make a lot of money out of. And it's also, I mean, I'm not going to go into this too much because I don't have enough time, but it's a result of like kind of contradictory pressures and the fact and other kind of issues as well. But I won't go into that too much because I don't really have time. But I think the point I've tried to make within this section is that modernisation under capitalism hasn't ended the oppression of women, it's changed the nature of the oppression of women rather than ended it. And I would argue that ending the oppression would only be possible under a socialist society where domestic work can be equally shared, a planned economy will allow for fair distribution of the workforce and removal of kind of the economic pressures, and divide and rule tactics will bring an end to negative attitudes towards women. I'll talk about divide and rule tactics a little bit more later on. I think like kind of turning more now like to kind of classical sort of Marxist things we talk about in terms of women's oppression. I want to talk about like where I see women's oppression from having arisen from, and I think it's very important. I mean, women's oppression is obviously one of many forms of oppression that exist and intersect with each other under capitalism, class, race, sexuality, and obviously class oppression itself, although something I kind of want to underline and that I'll come back to is I would argue there's a difference between class oppression which exists kind of in this, which obviously does exist in terms of like, you know, people will criticise working class people for like, oh, you can't talk properly, or you don't wear the right clothes and all these kind of things, and class exploitation, which I'd argue is the systematic underpinning of capitalism, which is that there's a certain very small section of society, the ruling class, that own the means of production, and they exploit the labour of people that work for them by not paying them for the amount of money that they produce, and therefore they take the profit by exploiting that labour. And I'd argue that's the systematic exploitation that underpins the oppressions that exist in society, and is where they arise from, is what I would argue. And I think, like, with an understanding, and I'll kind of move into that, of this kind of with that understanding of where the oppression flows from and how it's kind of manipulated within a class society, gives us an understanding of how we can kind of link up class struggle and women's struggle. Although I would emphasise, because I think this is something that's maybe said about Marxists quite a lot, that you all just talk about, oh, let's just wait for socialism, and until then, you know, it's cool, we'll just sit back, which is not correct at all. I think that it also involves pinning the two struggles together. It means fighting for every reform, and it means raising the question of women's rights at every opportunity. And in general, I think that's the attitude that Marxists should have, that we support all reforms that are going to benefit working people, and especially working women. But I would also argue that the basis of women's oppression points to its place in the class struggle for socialism. So if we kind of move back to sort of the classic Marxist work on it, it's Engels' origin of the family. Something I want to underline now, because I've been in quite a lot of classes where this has been said, is that I don't think Engels wasn't arguing that women's oppression comes about in capitalism. He's arguing that it comes about in class society, which is very different, because capitalism's only existed for maybe 200 to 300 years at the absolute longest. Class society, on the other hand, has existed for much longer than that. And I think that's quite important, because, I mean, obviously, if we're going to say that up until capitalism in like the 18th, 19th century, there was no such thing as sexism, that would obviously be nonsensical. So I think it's quite important to underline that. But what kind of Engels puts forward is that he talks about kind of primitive communist societies, and what he means by that is subsistence societies. So kind of the early beginnings of humanity, where all that could be produced was enough to keep people going, so only enough food to essentially keep people alive. And because of that, because that was the kind of mode of production, it meant that there wasn't, as we have today, because you didn't have a surplus, it wasn't possible for one person to, as is today, to kind of control a big amount of production and then sell it on. It was because all that was produced was enough to subsist. It meant that everybody had to work together. And how this relates to kind of sexism and misogyny is that it is true that there was a split in male and female labour at the time, and women tend to be in a different sphere from men for kind of biological reasons, obviously because they gave birth to children and these things. But it also meant that their kind of status in society was aided by the fact that at this time families were traced, like the conception of families that exist, which was different from now, but I'm not going to go into that because it's too complicated. It was traced through the mother line, because there was no such thing as marriage and fidelity as we understand it today, and I'll kind of discuss how that kind of comes about with class society. So for that reason, there wasn't kind of a notion of who a child's father was. It was the mother, and despite there being a split in what they did, the role that women played was kind of respected, because despite the fact that men did things like hunting and all these, which maybe seem like, oh, would that not be a bit more respected, they very rarely actually managed to get much. So it was women's labour that kind of was the underpinning of society. But moving on from this kind of early beginning of primitive communism, and we're talking about the period of the Neolithic Revolution, which brought tools and the domesticity of animals, which for the first time in human history led to the creation of a surplus. So there was ability to create more and produce more than just a subsistence level, which had been previously. And upon this basis, so from a Marxist perspective, a kind of a move forward in the mode of production, it meant that we kind of see the first beginnings of class society, because certain people and I think it's important at this point to underline certain men were able to kind of gather together as animals and tools and create a surplus that they could then sell on for profit. And we begin to have the distinction of rich and poor and the beginnings of like slavery and these kind of things. And as some began to amass wealth, as some began to amass wealth, they bought slaves and paid others to work on their land. So we see the first example of kind of worker and landowner. And this is kind of the beginning of where we see women beginning to be seen as inferior to men. It was within the work of men that profit was to be found, so their status was elevated. And it's also where we start seeing the nuclear, well, not quite the nuclear family as we understand it today, but more that kind of idea of marriage and fidelity coming into it, because it was kind of like now, whereas in the subsistence society, obviously it was there was nothing to pass on at the end of your life because you were living just hand to mouth. Because there had been the creation of a surplus, it meant that there was now things to pass on. Well, for certain people, not for everybody. There was things to be inherited, and that's where we see kind of the enforcement of female fidelity, underlying female fidelity, not so much male fidelity, started to come about, and we see the sort of beginnings of the idea of marriage, and obviously later on, kind of this produced the nuclear family. So I'd say that women's oppression began in the embryo of class society. I mean, we are talking very much the beginning, and nothing like the sort of sophisticated class society that obviously exists today under capitalism. But obviously capitalism has kind of grown out over a long period of time and through several transitions through, the kind of ancient slave societies, feudalism, and then kind of moving into capitalism. And I think we've seen the oppression of women kind of change along with that. It's existed, but its form has changed. And obviously, as I was talking about at the beginning, we've obviously seen that in the past 50 years, and that relates to several things. It relates to the changing of the economy and the change of the needs of the economy, but I think also the women's struggle obviously played a big part in that it put pressure on the ruling class and put pressure on the politicians. That meant that certain reforms had to be granted. But I would argue, and I think it's clear from what we said at the beginning, and I don't think anybody here disagrees with that because you wouldn't be here otherwise, that there's obviously still women are obviously still a very oppressed section of society, and I'd say that the women's question cannot be separated from the class question, but also the class question cannot be separated from the women's question. It goes two ways, and it's something that I think Trotsky said. I don't have the exact quotes at hand, so I'm paraphrasing, forgive me. But it was something along the lines of, you can't talk about having a successful socialist revolution until you're talking about complete emancipation and equality for women. So it underlined the two go hand in hand. But I think what we can see is that I would argue that women's oppression begins in the creation of class society, and it extends along with that. And I think as long as we have a capitalist society, I think women's oppression will exist because it's something that's very lucrative from a bourgeois point of view. Obviously we're talking about free work, and I think that's a key element of that, but ideologically the propagation of the nuclear family is very important to the upkeep of capitalism, and keeping women pigeonholed in a certain role for that is very important. And the sex industry, obviously, I think has become bigger and it's become more influential. And I think for these reasons, that the oppression of women is inherent within capitalism. I wouldn't say it's just sexism. I think it's the same with racism. I think Malcolm X said you can't have capitalism without racism, and I think that's certainly very true. And that's why I would argue that we need to be talking about a united struggle, and I think it's important, and I think the only way this can be successful is if we're talking about all people within the working class, within the proletariat, uniting together in a unified struggle to get rid of the class exploitation that underlines these oppressions, but also within that to get rid of the oppressions that exist within capitalist society. I mean, I think something that's very important and that I discussed is also like divide and rule and how that is used. You know, obviously, I think in the present period, it's obvious that in Britain, the ruling class is trying to kind of emphasise the immigration question and trying to say, oh, this isn't our fault, this isn't the boss's fault, this is the immigrants' fault. But it's the same with men and women. You know, there's an attempt to divide working class people on that, kind of saying, oh, but women are taking your jobs and should they really be working like this? And I think this is an important thing and something that we need to combat and respond to. And I think just to kind of discuss, because I mean I think this is all, you know, quite maybe theoretical in nature, and maybe in terms of like discussing like, well, okay, you're talking about like we need to overthrow capitalism and have a socialist society, but what does that actually mean, and what does that mean in relation to women? Well, I would say that with socialism will come an end. There will come an end of all the kind of forms of oppression used by the capitalist society, and that includes that faced by women. I mean, I'm not arguing it would be an automatic thing, that there would be a revolution and then all prejudice that exists will just completely die away. But what I would argue is there wouldn't be the material basis for the prejudice that exists in society today. There wouldn't be the need for it. So a socialist society wouldn't have a need for the nuclear family, which is often at the forefront of the exploitation of women. Having these kind of monogamous setups and having a family would be a choice rather than a kind of almost it's almost made compulsory within capitalist society. The necessity to pass on, well, you wouldn't have private property, so there wouldn't be a necessity to pass on private property. And yeah, so instead of like relying upon strict gender roles, which I think is something that capitalism does rely upon to keep its society going, because let's not forget as well, this is obviously a reason that they can kind of get away with paying women less, because women's labour is seen to not be as good as men, and in general women aren't seen to be quite up to the male standard. And obviously, as I said, relationships and families that do not conform to monogamous ideals will be accepted socially as well as those that do. And how would this be achieved? I think it would be achieved through there be a guarantee of work for all, and that would mean that work could be divided equally, which would also mean there was more opportunities for discussion for everybody to take place in discussions within society. I mean, we're talking about how a lot of working class women feel excluded from discussions on feminism. I'd say I'd extend that to discussions on politics, probably to a large extent, because you don't often get to come to the arenas where it is discussed. You know, places like the university and things like that obviously aren't as open to working class people. So you could divide up work equally, so that would mean that everybody would be able to partake in discussions and put forward their ideas and develop their own ideas as well. So it'd be a fair redistribution of working hours in order to spend as how they choose, so including, if they want to care for the family. But there would also be, and I tried to put this forward in a certain way, because I've heard of people before being accused of saying they want to nationalise the children. I want to make it clear, I'm not saying you have to nationalise the children, but you can have collectivisation in terms of like domestic work, I think a key thing that you'd be talking about in a socialist society would be free, high quality childcare. That would mean that both parents could work, and also in general, like things like bias on the basis of sex. So a lot of employers will say, oh, well, we don't want to recruit any women that are aged between 25 and 40 because they might get pregnant. Things like that would obviously come to an end. And yeah, no worker should have to face, nobody should have to face any form of oppression and discrimination. We'd be talking about equal maternity and paternity leave and education system. I think the education system is clear because obviously it enforces a lot of ideas that come from the top of society, and I think it's reinforced in our culture, ruling class ideas through several different mechanisms, but education is obviously an important one. And there would obviously be an emphasis on equality, which would aid in fighting sexist attitudes within society. And I think there'd be such an overhaul of the norms that exist today that they would be questioned. And like I say, the material basis for sexism and misogyny which exists within private property would be gone. I think, yeah, universal free childcare is a simple solution, and also, yeah, like I said, you know, that would mean the end of, you'd have an end to the double burden because you would have collectivised domestic work as well. Yeah, so I think, yeah, there'd be also important reforms of institutions that often have like kind of deeply ingrained oppression and discrimination. So, you know, the legal system obviously has a big culture of victim blaming, and I think that results from the fact that the legal system reflects the bourgeoisie in society, and it reflects their interest. Whereas if you had a system that was based on what was good for society and based on the majority rather than the minority, I think you could bring an end to that. And I think healthcare as well, it should be providing accurate, reliable and respectful care to women, informing them of reproductive choices. And I think that becomes possible under a socialist society where things like the services that are beneficial for society would be put at the forefront, whereas in the current period we're talking about privatisations and cutbacks under capitalism. And I think, just to end, I think it's very important that we talk about these things, and I think it's key that we link up the class struggle and the women's struggle, because I don't think either can be successful without the other, and I think they're inherently interlinked. And I think the struggle with Marxist ideas for a socialist society, it should be the struggle for humanity. It should be the struggle to end the primary thing is it's the struggle to end the exploitative system that creates these oppressions. So it's a struggle to end all of these exploitations and oppression throughout society. And I think that's obviously key for all of us here. I think that's why we're here today, because we obviously live in a highly oppressive and exploitative society, and I think that's been increased over the past few years for women, but and also in general for working class people around the world. So I think it's important that we put forward that these struggles are inherently interlinked, and I think as Marxists it's obviously our job to make that clear as well, and to put these things forward. And I think, yeah, I think, as I say, I think Marxism and the struggle for a socialist revolution is a struggle for humanity.